So the way this will work is I've got a couple topics and some questions I'd like to ask the panel, but I certainly don't want to monopolize the question and answer time. And I know you'll have questions for both Brent and some questions for the rest of the panel as well. But I think probably the place where we might start is thinking about, this challenge of moving from the ambition into the implementation, and thinking about the difficult challenge of doing that. And maybe we can think just about what you think are the challenges that cities really face when they start to make those difficult decisions, when the answers to the questions have to be different. So I'll take a question from I'll direct the question to each of you one at a time. Perhaps we could start, David, with you.
Oh, it's great being the first one. I think one of the challenges we have as a city is actually figuring out what we want to be, and we exist in a different context than a lot of other cities do. A lot of what we see here is very downtown, very intense urban orientation, and Edmonton is actually at a point in its evolution where it's going to have to decide what it wants to be. But it also has an influence outside of it, and I think most of you know I was previously to this job, I was actually the director of regional planning for the city, so we spent a lot of time talking to the region. That region actually has a big influence on us because there's different forms of development, there's different forms of urban growth that we don't have a control on. So you look at things like annexation, which we're trying to do right now, and that's probably to either improve the sprawl or limit the sprawl, whichever way you want to look at it. But we don't live on rock and space. We actually we're trying to actually improve the urban environment by getting a little bit more control of the region, raising the debate, I guess, in terms of what the region can be.
Kalen.
Great start, David. I have the microphone because I realized I was wearing, and this is going to cause a problem, gender inappropriate clothing for the clip-in. It's great. Love being a woman planner. It's great. So implementation. Thanks, Lindsay. What are some of the key challenges? From my perspective, so just like David, I also switched jobs recently with the city. I was doing policy planning work for about a decade as an urban planner with the City of Edmonton, and recently I've joined a great team of people who are doing much more implementation-focused work around actually getting approvals, development approvals and that kind of thing for new plans and rezonings. So it's been a bit of a change, and I've been able to experience a couple of different paces of work, not in terms of how hard you work each day, but how fast the change is that gets done over time. So what I would say in terms of key challenges are a sense of impatience. A lot of cities that are a little older than ours maybe have, they've gone through their own cycles, or they've seen different generations of building. We're a pretty young city, and there might be a sense of impatience here. How quickly will things turn around? So to kind of couple that comment, I think the most important thing that we can focus on is evidence-based decisions. So let's try to measure and monitor what's happening. Let's be realistic about the time frame within which change is possible. So we were chatting a little bit tonight about some of the infill work that our community and city council has done. And we just got these bylaws passed in April 2015. So what is that, 9 months ago? And people are asking, well, where's all the infill? Well, there you go. We've been through not even one construction season, and you know what? We haven't seen a big change, and that's normal. So being able to track things over time and watch them and have good evidence-based conversations is part of why we're here today to launch the growth strategy. And the last thing I'll hang on in terms of implementation and what we need to pay attention to is community conversation. It's not okay to think that just because one community conversation occurred, that was the conversation and now everything is okay or there was full agreement. In fact, that isn't the desired outcome. So if we want to be building a city all the time, which is an organic, dynamic process, we have to be talking all the time. And it also means that we have to be willing to change. We need to be good listeners, and we need to be able to change course. So I would say those are the three things that I've come up against, or positively, the big opportunities that I'm continuing to try to leverage.
Those are good words. I can sense you've got a question there, so I'm going to come back to Simon.
Can you hear me with this microphone? Yeah, I can just turn this off. I assume the button's at the bottom. I was just going to say a couple things. The challenge in a city like Edmonton is that Edmonton has a very widespread employment base. Only about 1/10 of the jobs in the region are actually in the CBD. And then if you were to think about the core of Edmonton, if you were to say there's about 750,000 jobs in the region, in kind of the core areas, there's maybe about 300,000, and of that, 75,000 are in like the actual CBD. So the challenge is that we have to build a city around a very diverse employment structure in terms of the typology of jobs we have, the nature of our economy. We've got everything from like Stantec right in the heart of the downtown to thousands of people working in Fort Saskatchewan in refineries, to gigantic warehouses like Coonamble, which has a 700,000 square foot warehouse with like a dozen people working on it because it's supply chain management. But cities need all of that. So the challenge is, how do we kind of do something for everyone a little bit? That is one of the challenges. What I talk about, and I just wrote a blog on this recently, is radical incrementalism. And so a lot of cities love to chase unicorns. Mayors love to chase unicorns. They love the big, sexy projects. Sometimes you hit a home run, like we did with Arena, that I really think it became the catalyst we all wanted it to be. But the stats show that 65% of all these major projects fail and never get off the ground. Cities actually get real, sustainable change when they adopt radical incrementalism, which is really about having a long-term vision and you absolutely relentlessly implement it. So if you were to take example of bike lanes, some years we're going to have money to build a few meters of bike lane because it's a lean economic time. Other years you've got money to build kilometers of bike lane, the cumulative of which over 20 years can be transformational in terms of shifting the mode of transportation. But the idea is that whatever you do, every year you move the yardsticks a little bit. Some years you move it more. And there's lots of examples of cities that have been able to be unbelievably transformational. They just had a strong vision and they really believed, and no matter what happened, the yardsticks always moved in terms of incrementalism, or implementing. Because at the end of the day, as planners, we all know that 90% of good planning is implementation. I mean, coming up with a award-winning plan, not saying that's easy, but that's really easy relative to the implementation. That's the tough stuff.
Well, one of the interesting conversations we had in the build-up to this was about how the little things get in the way of the big things sometimes, the small everyday problems, whether it be a construction site with bricks on the sidewalk, or something's gone wrong, or a community conversation that's gone wrong. I'd like to get you to reflect on the way in which cities and planners can actually engage with those little things and work with communities to overcome them, and to get a sense of your experience of those little things in creating big problems for big ambitions. Brent, can I throw that one to you first?
Well, I'm a long-term thinker. I think every planner has to be, but I've also embraced impatience in the sense that I think we've got a narrative going on out there and where the consequences, the math, the storytelling is all coalescing with a pretty powerful narrative for doing something different faster. And so I like creating a sense of urgency because we don't have all the time in the world to make some of the changes we're talking about. So I like little things and big things going on all at once. Whether, you might be chasing one unicorn, you shouldn't be chasing a herd. But you should also have horses in there, and you should also have, dogs and cats. I don't know where the metaphor goes. But the idea is that you're working at every scale. And so the little things, as you say, can be a barrier. And, you always have to put things into their proper perspective. If politicians let little things kill big ideas, then I don't blame the people who brought up the little things. I blame the politicians. I think politicians have to not be so distracted and be willing to be more brave. But I also think the little things in city making, and that's why I ended my talk that way, can be incredibly powerful. They can create a context for a bigger achievement. They can create momentum. They can do all sorts of different things. So I like the little things. The little things are not a problem for me. I think they should be more of an opportunity.
Thank you. David or Kalen, would you like to?
Yeah, I mean, I think the
I
little,
believe that growth comes from individuals that we take the risk to have families and children.
yeah, I wouldn't disagree with you. I mean, coming back to the topic about the little things are what kill us. Because often we have a big idea about what we want to achieve, but where it will fall down is the details. And unfortunately, the greatest plan is, as you said, it's based on its it's judged on its implementation. So I mean, it's one of the things we're conscious of in this organization. Yeah, little things. A lot of the time, you look at visions that are.
Yeah, let him speak. You have children?
Yeah, I do. A lot of the visions we have are based on sort of an idealized adult lifestyle, and sometimes you forget about that. What Brent was showing us earlier about some of the urban environments, very urban environments where children are welcomed and they're sort of nurtured in that. You don't always see that when you're thinking of these things, but that's what actually makes it whole, and that's the details. You forget about that.
Thank you. Let's have a question from the audience if we have one. I see a few hands. There's some mics running around. If you do have a question, I do encourage you to put your hand up and talk to the staff there. So there's a mic that we can all hear you at. People hear you, Vaughn. And if you could just state who you are and who you're directing your question to in the first sense, that'd be great. And I'll probably force the rest of the panel to answer it anyways, but go ahead.
Well, as far as who I am, well, I'm going to say that I'm a shepherd from the Balkans. Kind of lost his way, ended up here. I used to live in Vancouver around 2002. I used to teach English as second language to these Chinese kids. And around then, Vancouver was kind of starting to develop. And so I asked one of them, what do you think of all these buildings going up? He said, too slow. Not impressed at all. So getting back to your radical incrementalism, I've seen what the Chinese cities are doing. And pretty much they're eating our lunch. I'm pretty sure they're eating our lunch at this point. So I do agree with what Brent said, that maybe not all unicorns need to be chased, but perhaps, at least one.
I think you got to ask yourself, what is the outcome you really desire? What do you want to get at? There's lots of horror stories of empty Chinese cities where they built the cities, we've all seen them, the cities, the malls that have been erected really quickly, villages, as you kind of said, the kind of vertical sprawl. There's lots of examples of that, but the question is, does it achieve what we really want, which in the kind of metric of success for cities, which is vibrancy? Does it really have the messy vibrancy that we really love? When I go around to cities, and the places I gravitate to are the places that have the messy vibrancy, that have been able to grow organically and incrementally and are more interesting. They're not just the big Targets and Canadian Tires and Tim Hortons, but the places that have a collection of mom and pops, and they deliberately cultivated a collection of mom and pops. Now, for some people, maybe the metric of success is having 1,000 50-story buildings going up in a year. That's not my metric of success in terms of what I think of great urbanism. Great urbanism to me is walking along Pearl Street in downtown Boulder. So Pearl Street, maybe you could call it the most successful street in America. 100,000 people, and it has the highest lease rates of any pedestrian main street in the entire United States, despite only having 100,000 people. They had a long-term plan, started in the 70s, to develop it into a phenomenal downtown. Some years they did a little bit and just planted flowers and more hanging baskets. And other years they did radical big things and spent a couple $1 million on streetscape. The result today is that it is the most vibrant, successful pedestrian main street in the entire United States in a community of 100,000 that's more than an hour outside of Denver. So my point is, you don't even have to be New York to be a great urban place. It can happen in a small place like 100,000. And to me, that's a better metric of success than how fast you can pour concrete.
Brent, I think you had a follow-up to that.
I agree with the commentary about China. Because of Vancouver's connection to Asian development. We get a lot of Chinese delegations and have studied it, and there's very little I would want to replicate or copy from the Chinese experience, including their speed. I want to touch on the Boulder example, and a really important distinction about incrementalism, which I find, I've got to read your blog to see what you said, but the Boulder experience where you said that one year they put in planters and other years they did other things. There's a design philosophy that I learned when I was very young and has stuck with me called never finished, always complete. And the idea is that whenever you're designing something, it can't look half done. But you're constantly adding to it. So planters 1 year, et cetera, et cetera.
It's constantly building.
Right. Great example of incrementalism that works. Bike lanes, on the other hand, is not that. Because bike lanes, it's not complete if it's not complete. And so very different idea. My feelings about incrementalism in the context of a biking network, very different. You need a substantial move. And the example that if in a lean year you can do a short stretch, to me that's an example of treating, no offense, treating the bike lanes as an example of, again, if we have money left over. I have never seen a year in a Canadian municipality where there was not money for roads. So this is not about finding money. This is about finding new money. This is about reprioritizing. And what I've said to cities is just take your 10-year plan for bike expenditure and squash it into the first year. And if you literally don't have to spend money for the next 9 years, that's okay. I'd still prefer that because you're building something from day one that has a chance of succeeding. What I observed in Vancouver, which is known as a biking city, but did it wrong in my opinion, and I was there at the time, was every year we would open another bike lane and I would do the same round of media where I would get asked, why isn't it working? Answer, because there's not a complete network. Are we done now? No, of course not, because we don't have a complete network. And I always tried to say to people, could you imagine doing one road, one street for cars, and then asking, are we done yet? So there needs to be, I love the incrementalism layer, but I think there's at least two categories.
There's
10 seconds.
10 seconds.
Just quick context.
Sure.
We did that, and what we did, that only works if you do it well.
Oh, yeah.
And so we quickly said, we're going to build a whole bunch of bike lanes, and we did it all over the place, and we did it horribly with slapping down paint, as opposed to, and so what happened? The suburbs kind of said, what the hell did you do taking away my lane? And you put down a bit of paint, and it's covered with grit and snow for half the year. And so as a result, we've really kind of gone backwards in terms of the social license to build bike lanes in the city, as opposed to saying, let's pick an area stretch that we know it's going to be successful, like Oliver to downtown, and build the Cadillac segregated bike lane, make it super safe, do it well, and as a consequence, then everyone else wants it, and then we're going to incrementally build it a little more. And
I got it.
That was definitely more than 10 seconds.
Let me just say this. Cadillac separated bike lane is the problem.
well, it can be planters.
It can be
planters.
really
can be
cheap and
planters.
simple.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I'm going to take another question from the audience.
But your point about the snow and all that, great example of doing it wrong.
I have to admit that I'm one of the people who rolls my eyes when I hear about Vancouver, being a former resident.
Where are you? Where is she?
Sorry, here.
they're okay.
Hi.
Hi.
Because I think one of the greatest challenges in Vancouver that threatens the livability is the affordability issue. So I ask a targeted question forward to you in terms of how land use planning has influenced the high property prices that we see in Vancouver. And to the rest of the panel as well, just that the changes that we make to make cities better often displace the people who can benefit most from those investments. So city planners, what's our role in engaging with those market forces to ensure that it is an equitable and sustainable city?
So Brent, maybe I can get you to briefly answer the question about Vancouver, and then I'll ask Kalen and David to respond to thinking about some of the infill developments we're seeing in some of our mature neighborhoods now.
Well, the only consequence of good city making relative to affordability is the inevitable consequence of doing things well as more people want it. Most of the problems with affordability, in my opinion, go beyond that. They have to do with how real estate is taxed, all sorts of financial levers that other cities have tried to address affordability. I think in the Vancouver's case, the emphasis has been on trying to build more purpose-built rental, which is a critical part of affordability. To address affordability in the broadest sense through land use planning, including how much it costs for people to get around. So rental housing on transit, for example, versus rental housing elsewhere. You're putting the housing cost, the transportation cost, the energy cost, and then the other side, the employment side, all into a conversation about affordable city making. I think Vancouver has probably put more effort than any city I've seen at that equation, and yet still struggled with the result. Because many of the things that are pushing the affordability don't have anything to do with the land use planning levers, and have more to do with arguments for levels of government to introduce taxation levers or things like that.
Thank you. Kalen.
All right, thanks for that. I was hoping for a question like that, actually. That's a really good one. Affordability is one of the things that preoccupies me as a city planner. One of the things we were talking about tonight over dinner was how unique Edmonton is, in the sense that it is so young, the youngest city in this country, big city, and the fact that it is so middle class, one of the most middle class cities in the world. And I think that we don't recognize how important that is and what an amazing resource that is for who we are as people, how we engage, and how we can legitimately tackle things like social equity and poverty. So I do think it's a critical thing to think about as we talk about infill development specifically and development in the suburbs. There's two kinds of affordability that are worth thinking about. One is how affordable is the city as a whole, and that's where we get into the infrastructure costs and the life cycle costs, and that is an important conversation to have. The other piece is how affordable are the actual homes for actual people, and that is extremely important to address. So one of the things that I think that we will grapple with as a city as we continue to mature is that what was an expectation for an affordable type of house for our parents, which was, or grandparents, which was a single family house in a what is now a mature neighborhood, but was formerly a suburb, first generation suburb. For this generation and future generations, that housing form is going to change. So what will be affordable, we'll still have affordable housing, but it'll be an affordable condo, it'll be an affordable townhouse, it'll be an affordable duplex or a house with a secondary suite or garage suite, maybe both. But that, I think, is the challenge. So when we're thinking about apples to apples, as we're having these discussions over generations, I think that's an important thing that I'm certainly thinking about, and that I know others are as well.
Yeah, I think one of the things that give me sleepless nights is, and I agree completely, we were talking about this idea of we have a lot of housing stock that's a similar age, and it's going to turn over maybe within the next generation or two. It depends how it does that. I mean, as planners, we always look at this holy grail of a complete community of all sorts of incomes and different lifestyles and all that. What I fear with infill sometimes is that we may end up gentrifying that, and we'll end up pushing the affordable stuff out further into coming back to my opening comments. We don't live in a vacuum, and we'll push it outside the city. So we'll end up with a gentrified core and very affordable but really unsustainable ring outside it.
Two quick comments. You fix this with market urbanism, and you allow both the market to intensify where it kind of wants to intensify, where the public has invested serious dollars in infrastructure like transit and public realm improvements, et cetera, and doing that through form-based code as opposed to traditional land use planning. And then the other part about Vancouver, it could fix it tomorrow if it really wanted to through progressive mill rates. If you were to have a sliding scale of mill rates so that anything that's below this threshold is 1, and anything above this threshold is 2 or 3, you could fix Vancouver pretty quick. If all of a sudden the mill rate were 4 on anything over $5 million or $2.5 million. Of course, the trouble is politically you wouldn't be able to do it because everyone thinks their home is a lottery ticket and doesn't want to pay the high taxes in the meantime. But if they really wanted to fix it, you'd have a progressive mill rate and you could kill that problem pretty quick, or at least stop it from getting worse.
I would probably cover the one I saw in the paper this morning that went for $750,000 over list.
Oh, yeah.
Kitsilano. I mean, it's just mind-boggling.
I'll take another question.
Hi, I'm an engineer turned journalist, sort of, somehow.
is, so I work in the downtown core, and I live in a mature neighborhood that's immediately adjacent to the downtown core, which means I am the rare Edmontonian that can take the bus to and from work very comfortably, and it doesn't sacrifice any lifestyle. However, the core of Edmonton sort of seems to be in this emerging cycle where, as a consumer, there's no incentive for me to stay downtown after work. There's some restaurants and bars open, but shopping opportunities all close when I leave work. And even something as simple as like picking up groceries on my normal route home is prohibitive on transit because there isn't a grocery store on the line that I take home. So it really sort of has this feeling like private sector business moving in to service people in this area almost seems like a bit of a gamble for them. You look at even Jasper Avenue has going on over a year of a vacant grocery store sitting right in the middle of Jasper Avenue. How do we, in a city that's sort of striving to be, this model that we're talking about, convince business to roll the dice on being part of that core and serving people in that area, and how do we convince the business to move in so that it makes it more attractive?
Who wants to have a first go at that?
The
Simon?
businesses follow the people. And so it's all about the people. I remember Vancouver did a study, and I might get the numbers wrong, but I want to say when they did their downtown plan, they kind of figured out what was that tipping point where all of a sudden it had that kind of 24/7 vibrancy that everyone clamors for. And I want to say it was like 30,000 people in the CBD or something like that, around that, in that ballpark, 30,000 people, that when they hit that tipping point, then all of a sudden it just kind of went that way. And then it was that critical mass that all of a sudden then everyone wanted to be downtown. And then all the businesses wanted to be downtown. As we know from studies, and I think everyone here thinks safe to say is an urban geek, otherwise you wouldn't be here. And I was going to say, including the panel here, it's just that all the studies overwhelmingly show that in these kind of downtown area, the merchants always think that the drive-by traffic is their bread and butter, but the studies show the opposite, that 80-85% of their customers actually come within a mile or 2 or 3 miles of the business. And so the single most important thing you can do is move mountains, do everything you can policy-wise, land use planning, form-based code, every tool in the book, to dramatically increase the population, the core, and all that stuff kind of follows. But you're never going to incentivize a grocery store to come in if they don't feel like the critical mass of people are going to be there. So Vancouver was all about the people, and then the businesses kind of followed in mass.
Yeah, I think, I'm not sure how long you've lived in Edmonton, but I mean, Edmonton was 26 years. So you'll remember that Edmonton was pretty much economically disemboweled in the early 80s. And I often try to imagine what would have happened if things had turned out differently. I think as planners, we have a sort of an eye on the long game. And what you're seeing now is sort of a rebirth of the downtown. So you'll start seeing that stuff happen. It may happen in my grandchildren's lifetime, but I think you'll actually see the rebirth of a downtown here.
You lead, oh, sorry, Brent, go ahead.
I agree that it's the people. Vancouver went in the downtown peninsula from 45,000 people to about 107, 110,000 people now in about 20, 25 years. So the threshold was probably a little more than 30,000, but you're right. There was a careful consideration of what kind of body heat would be necessary. So this to me is an example of changing the conversation away from having your cake and eat it too, because if you have a conversation in the community about how to attract a grocery store and keep the school open and do all these kinds of things, public will invariably say, we want those things, but we don't want more population. But that's not an option on the table. That won't work. So there needs to be really candid conversation about what it would take to achieve the things that communities actually want, including whether it's attracting the grocery store. I will say that that's why so many of us urban geeks watch so closely the models of grocery stores. And have you noticed that, like other forms, the urban store, the smaller store, to get access to the holes in the gaps of the trade areas has become an interesting thing. So sometimes the business can change its model, but if they don't change its model, then you won't get them to roll the dice, as you put it. They don't roll dice. They change their model. But the other thing I'll say is, what Vancouver also did was once it got the population that would attract the retailers, what it said for about a decade is if you want to come and have access to our urban population, you have to play by urban rules. So the Home Depot that I showed you came after 10 years of Home Depot coming with proposals to do a suburban, single-story Home Depot building with surface parking. And the answer was no for 10 years, until they finally agreed to be part of an urban condition. Similarly, we have a Costco downtown with towers sprouting out of it. So the point is, once you have the population to engage those retailers, you have to force them to come in under urban conditions. Because if you let them build their suburban models, which they will fight to the teeth, that's the only thing they can build, then you start to erode that body heat. You start to erode the placemaking and all the things that make it an urban place. So make the retailers come in under urban terms.
Kalen, can I get your response to that? Because I sometimes hear that Edmonton we lack the confidence of a really urban place, and we struggle to make those truly urban decisions.
Are we talking about grocery stores? We're talking about confidence.
You can talk about Sobeys if you want.
Any business moving in.
Any business moving into downtown. My esteemed panelists are right. There's nothing that drives businesses to come and make business decisions except for customers. And you get customers for a walkable downtown type of business model via local residents. So honestly, I think we know that in this case, the answer is pretty straightforward. We just need a lot more people to live downtown, and that grocery store and every other grocery store will spring back to life. And we've done so many studies about what drives commercial development. People do. That is why when the suburbs grow with a lot of houses, we also see a lot of commercial that happens there. It's commercial follows people. It's a pretty straightforward correlation. So in terms of our swagger and where are we right now, I think we are a city that struggles with its self-esteem sometimes. That is something that I have said before in the past. We're a young city. We have a history here that sometimes goes unrecognized, I think. We have a lot of different histories and narratives in this place. And we also have been a city that's built very quickly and then stopped or very quickly slowed for a time. Very cyclical, and it kind of gives us this roller coaster, lurching feeling sometimes as a community of city builders. So, it played out in its worst expression. That can mean when times are good, just grab what you can, and when times are bad, anything will do. That's the worst case expression. I think we're over that. I think we're a city with some self-confidence. I think we have more of a self-esteem, and I think that we know now that we deserve urbanism, that we deserve quality space, and that it's not about how fast we're going to build things, but it's about what we're building for ourselves, who we're honoring, what pasts we're thinking about when we do so, and what kind of people and what kind of community we're going to become. I don't think it's a race. I know there's been a lot of kind of speed kind of questions and speed comments up here. People have been building cities way before there were urban planners. We are very new arrivals on the scene. So I think that the best thing we can do is be a little bit humble and realize just where we fit into the hierarchy of our legacy as humans on this planet.
Yeah, that 30,000 figure is kind of magical, and that's in my mind, I don't know, maybe it's because I grew up in a place about that size, but that's what actually gives you a fully self-contained community. It gives you that mass of people and activity and everything. It's actually where you start getting expectations of things like transit, even rudimentary transit. So that seems to be this sort of sweet spot number. So if you can get those actually living in a contained area like a downtown, then you're gonna see rebirth.
Well, and to Brent's earlier point, and also having the discipline to say no to ugly. And saying no to ugly is easy to do during a boom time. It's harder during a recession when people just want growth for growth's sake, and it takes a lot more discipline to do the long play and say no.
We had an elected official a few years ago that said our tolerance for crap is now 0, which is probably, it's a good comment.
I want to carry this conversation along. In particular, I mean, David, you had to bring up disemboweled economies. We had an
Walking
update from
Dead,
the finance minister yesterday, which wasn't rosy in terms of a provincial picture. We've gotten used to in Edmonton talking about the 170,000 people that are going to be here in a decade, and we've used that to drive the kind of urban growth. It looks like we're in a different context now. So I'd like to get each of your thoughts on how you maintain the positive kind of approach and the momentum and doing things right through what's going to be a protracted, difficult economic time.
You want me to answer that?
You brought it up.
Swell. Yeah, I mean, again, as planners, as people that are into building places, we always need to keep that long-term perspective in mind. So whether the city will hit a certain population threshold in a certain period of time is kind of irrelevant. What we should be doing is planning for a number, not a year, but a number. So Edmonton, in reality, we should be planning this city for 2 million or 3 million people and doing all the stuff that's required to build the backbone to do that. It'll just take longer, but you're still going to get there. I think a couple of years ago we were doing an annexation open house down south, and I told my colleagues this. We had this revelation. I was standing at one of the boards, realized the entire city of Saskatoon had moved here in the space of 10 years. Okay, that's kind of stunning when you think about it, but where that gets accommodated actually has a really strong influence on how you grow. I think we can actually do it better. Sometimes these little dips in the economy actually give us a chance to take a breath and actually think about doing things right, rather than just accommodating the big bucket of crazy that we're in.
It also provides opportunities that weren't there before. First of all, growth always happens. Even I remember asking somebody, an academic from Cleveland in housing, why Cleveland as a metropolitan area was shrinking in population, but it still had something like 10,000 housing starts. And I thought, well, how can it be shrinking in population and still have housing starts? Because housing growth exceeds population growth often. And it does that because of things like divorce and other things. So the number of households are kind of constantly increasing, and then we're kind of almost abandoning certain areas and then moving to other areas. So I don't see us kind of this cataclysmic population decline, but I do see, even if it's a slower growth, there'll still be growth. And the question is, where do we orient that growth towards? And the opportunities it affords are, a couple things happen when it gets slower. And with some of the changes that are happening, we see a lot more kind of small scale entrepreneurs kind of get in the market and do small scale infill developments that weren't happening previously. The other thing I noticed, for example, in suburban development, we're talking about urbanism, but in suburban development, one of the things that's actually happening today that wasn't happening last year is that people doing brand new subdivisions, they don't have the tract housing builders to sell to that they did last year. So they're selling to Joe Public. Well, what's happening is Joe Public, who's buying it, are often builders that come from certain ethnic communities that have not had the housing typology they've been clamoring for provided. So in certain areas, they're having huge demand for housing from these small independent builders. They're building housing that caters to immigrants who are driving our population growth. So they're building homes with 8, 10 bedrooms, 2 kitchens, one of which is a spice kitchen. And so that type of housing typology wasn't even getting built a couple of years ago because only the larger kind of tract housing builders were building stuff. And now these independent businesses are able to get in the market and cater to that type of multi-generational housing. So these are the kind of things that can happen when you get slowdown. You get different opportunities and different housing typologies coming up.
When I was planning in Calgary, I got used to this boom and bust mentality, so I understand it. And it was my predecessor in Vancouver who challenged the notion that I had and other people had that, well, you can have those standards in Vancouver because you're a successful city. And what Larry taught me was that all of those standards were established before the city was successful. It was when not much was happening, which is actually the easiest time to do it. It's amazing. The excuse, you can't have high standards when the economy is bad for obvious reasons. You also can't have high standards when the economy is good, because everything is so hot, it's so hard to change standards while you're moving fast. Suddenly it becomes a narrative where you can never have high standards, no matter what the circumstance of the city is. I believe you've got a perfect opportunity to establish your standards for urbanism, which are not Cadillac, which by definition can be lighter, quicker, cheaper, as the PPS says, or that have the right urbanistic principles and performance without higher material costs or construction costs or what have you. The narrative that good urbanism is more expensive is false. It's a false choice. So I think as you set your standards for how to perform better urbanistically, you can make the clear statement that none of this should translate into a more expensive product necessarily, or more expensive municipal costs. The opposite is true, et cetera, et cetera.
Let's have another couple questions from the audience. I see lots of hands.
Hi, my name is Chris Chan. I'm with the Edmonton Bicycle Commuters. If 2015 were the standard year of incremental changes for bike lanes in Edmonton, we'd run out of bike lanes to remove in 6 years. And hopefully that's going to change next year with the new lanes. My question though is actually, it's about density and...
You have to speak right into it, directly into it.
Hello?
No.
Yeah. My question is about density and building that really good quality urban form and bringing in those businesses. Oliver is the densest neighborhood in Edmonton. And I was biking behind the brewery district the other day. Between the shared use path and the brewery district, there's a 10-foot chain link fence and then a blank wall. And then on the other side of that wall is a big parking lot separated by the commercial building. If in our highest density neighborhood, that's what we're getting, then what hope is there and what are we to expect for the future?
I think it gets back to the earlier point that Brent made, which is raising the bar of excellence in terms of design, and then moving mountains to make sure we never get dead space. Dead space is pedestrians, dead space is cyclists. You know, the only people that find those spaces beautiful are the Road Builder Association of Alberta. But I think it's the point you made earlier in your presentation, which is about you move mountains to never create dead space, and then, for example, when you're, especially along your core pedestrian areas, for example, pushing, changing the type of form as well. So things that create dead space like banks, other type of large format uses, trying to push them to the second floor. So they've got maybe a Main Street entrance, but then you kind of walk up the stairs to the second floor. Doing those kind of things, and again, doing that consistently everywhere and having that be your standard, I think is really critical. Again, there's some good news and bad news about Edmonton. Perhaps the bad news is that Edmonton might have one of the world's largest collections of disposable architecture. But the good news is, because it's disposable and has a shelf life, we're going to have to rebuild it. And when we do rebuild it, we get it right the next go around. And that's really what a part of this night is about. How do we get it right when we kind of go, how do we raise the bar? Because a lot of it is disposable. So as we rebuild it, let's get it right the next go around. Let's make it sustainable. Let's embrace good principles of urbanism.
And let's also accept that we won't get it all right all the time. And there's going to be things that we could do better, and you'll look at them, and as planners, you're going to see that as you go through your career. Yeah, we could have done that better.
Kalen, do you want to have a response to that? I mean, what's the conversation like amongst planners in the city? Because you know about the chain link fences and the walls as well, right?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, you're right. You know what we've done, there's a couple things that we can do. We can focus on really expensive fixes and overhaul all of our infrastructure and That will take a ton of commitment and political will, and to change those budget books. And then we can also do small, cheap, temporary things. And if we find a big ugly wall, we can take some paint and throw it on it. And if we find a chain link fence, like a little bit of guerrilla urbanism could cut a hole in it. And I'm just saying that there's like the on-grid and there's the off-grid urbanism. And city building is not owned by city planners. It is not owned by City Hall. It is not owned by engineers. The people who own city building are the citizens of the city. So there's not necessarily a structural fix for everything. And in fact, I wouldn't want to live in a city where everything was perfect and there are no problems to fix and where experts were the ones who came in and redesigned problems. I actually think be playful in the space, take a little ownership for it. Don't do anything illegal, but sometimes ask forgiveness, if you get what I'm cooking. Have some fun. It's our city. You know what? Honestly, it's our city. And what's the worst thing that could happen? You know, if there's something ugly that goes up, even if there's an ugly building, you know, it's not the end of the world. And also, it'll fall down eventually. So the good news is, really, when I think about city building, the thing that I think we've got to get right, build the grids right. The systems and the networks are basically the bones and circulatory systems of our organism called a city. The rest of it, like the buildings and the landscaping and things, we can rebuild these and we can test them out and tear them down and try them again. And we have to take urbanism and building great things seriously, but at the same time, I challenge us all not to be too serious, such that we get so caught up in doing things perfectly that we get a little bit of analysis paralysis.
I sometimes feel like we sometimes try to fix problems with how we did it yesterday, which is spending big dollars. And sometimes the best examples of how we've kind of done it right are when we've relied on ingenuity and creativity. So the Lego bridge that you showed, it's from Germany. It's this, I can't pronounce it, it's like this 5-6 syllable German city that starts with a W. And it was an abandoned railroad overpass that was abandoned for, I think, 20 or 30 years or something like that. And they had a design competition, and a local street artist had come up with the concept for the Lego bridge. So they transformed what was an abandoned overpass that was very unsafe, and nobody desired to go there, and only cars went through. And for the cost of $1,000 of paint, transformed it into the Lego bridge. It now, I understand, receives something like several million tourists a year go there. And Lego is the most popular toy on the planet, more than Mattel, more than anything. People love Lego. And so people from all over the world have gone there to photograph themselves beside the Lego bridge. And so for the cost of $1,000 with the paint, they transformed what was an unsafe, ugly, horrible place into a real kind of showpiece for the city of only 300,000 people. And so my point is that sometimes it's just about creativity and whimsy and imagination, and it could be as little as $1,000 to get transformation.
Another question, if we have a little bit more time.
I just want to say quickly, we're all saying hopefully valuable things, but I hope the recording got everything you just said, because it was brilliant. And I think that should go on YouTube and go viral.
You've been talking about plans for growth citywide. I want to bring it down to the community level, because that's where I'm coming from. I'm with the Woodcroft Community League, so I'm in one of the mature neighborhoods. One of the things that we have tried to embrace is the infill project. I understood there was something like a 25% intention of increasing maturity in buildings in mature neighborhoods by about 25%. But one of the things that they failed to look at in our community is that we embraced infill long before it became the buzzword for the city. And so what you're asking us to do is actually increase our infill, not by 25%, but probably more like 45% overall from the original community. And unfortunately, there wasn't a lot of planning or foresight when they agreed to do the projects in this community, because they built a huge senior citizens high-rise, which put our demographics for seniors up over 25%. We have a significant rental housing complex in our community, which puts our low-income rentals over 50%. Our rental rates are over 60%. And what we were hoping for with infill is that it would help to revitalize our community and bring young people into the community. And instead what's happening is developers are coming in with plans that will only exacerbate the problems that we're having right now. And it just seems like the planning is being driven by developers rather than what's best for the community. And when I've talked to city planners and asked them, do you even take into consideration the demographic of one of these mature neighborhoods? When you're approving a project, they say they don't look at demographics. And our city does a census every 2 years, and yet our planners don't look at the demographics in a community when they're approving projects for a community. I can't see bringing in more of the same into our community, doing anything to revitalize it. If anything, it's going to make it worse. You're either going to turn Woodcroft into a community totally of senior citizens or low-income families, because people aren't going to want to move in there. There's not enough options for it.
Good question. Planning at the community level.
I know the least on this panel about the context you're discussing, so maybe I should start. There's nothing like speaking with absolutely no knowledge. There's a fundamental conversation about so-called mature neighborhoods. I'm never quite sure how to take that phrase, by the way. Does it suggest other neighborhoods are immature? But the conversation about the nature of change in neighborhoods, I don't know if any of the things you said about the way planning was done are true or not. But I will say that I think a strategy like infill or intensification or what have you should be neighborhood-based. It should be not one size fits all. We introduced terms in our planning like gentle, hidden, and invisible density to have conversations about change and what change could do in different neighborhoods that was always based on not just the past demographics, but how you would like those demographics to evolve over time. Because you're not trying to cast a neighborhood in amber. You're trying to facilitate choice and change within neighborhoods too, while respecting character. So I'd be surprised if it were true that the planners didn't consider demographics. But you're also not a slave to demographics. You're not a slave to the way things have been in the past. But for me, if you're going to move to, what did you call it? Was it the unicorn of complete neighborhoods? Somebody said complete communities was the goal. I think that's true. And if you're facilitating so-called completeness, I think adding in strategic pieces to the puzzle to facilitate change and how neighborhoods can age in place, etc., is to me one of the most interesting opportunities we have in change, in planning of neighborhoods. When we did laneway housing, for example, people said, well, who's going to buy those? And everyone was focused on who would live in those houses. What there wasn't consideration for until we broadened the conversation was the domino effect when you introduce those housing types in. Because the aging parents, for example, who wanted to downsize as empty nesters but couldn't because they refused to move out of their neighborhood, could downsize into the laneway house and give the primary house to their kids and grandkids who otherwise wouldn't have been able to afford to live in the neighborhood. At different parts in the life cycle, that could be a mortgage helper to allow a young family to be able to afford a house. At different parts of the life cycle, it could be a place for the aging teenager who wants their own space. Or it could just be plain old-fashioned rental housing potential opportunity. Or it could be where the caregiver lives. Council actually asked me at one point, could we do a study of who's living in the secondary suites and the laneway houses in our neighborhoods? And I said, yes, we could do that, but I'm relatively confident that if we studied it 3 years later, it would be a different answer. The whole point is that you're creating flexibility and nimbleness and change. So to me, I like that kind of conversation where you're talking about how communities can evolve and such. I take your point that you don't want a particular community to be perceived as exacerbating existing problems. It should be about facilitating existing options. Or broadening existing options.
One size fits all is not working.
No. And I do agree with you that it shouldn't just be market-driven. Developers told me, why are you bothering, when we were doing this eco-density exercise about how the city could densify and achieve many of our goals, many developers and architects said to me, Brent, why are you wasting time with laneway housing? We have more bang for the buck just putting towers at transit stations. And my response is, not everyone wants to live in a tower at transit stations. We're facilitating options and choices. And not everything is about carbon carbon footprint and climate change. Sometimes it's about aging in place in neighborhoods. There's all sorts of reasons why we're having conversations about growth and change, and having a more robust and mature conversation about that would be a good thing.
I'd like to get the rest of the panel to come back in on this. But I thought I would interject. You know, we talked quite a lot at dinner about the importance of engaging the community and working with communities to know what, you know, their desires and visions and ambitions for their own communities and neighborhoods are. And so when I heard that question, I also heard, hey, we want to talk to you about what we really want here. And so when we're thinking about these challenges of community at the planning at the community level, I'd like to get you to reflect on the way in which we engage those communities in the planning process.
Great, easy. Lots of easy questions, Kevin.
It's my job.
Yeah. I'll just try to keep my piece short here, but one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot in my professional practice as a public servant, because keep in mind that's what kind of planner I am. I'm working for the city, being paid by the taxpayers, working to help council make decisions. I worry a lot about, or think about a lot, what engagement means and who we're talking to and how. And because I think it's really important. I really value this, and I think that we're having an ongoing conversation with ourselves about ourselves, and that's one of the most fascinating things that human beings can do, is just kind of continually try to understand each other better and to drive important conversations forward. But I think it would be disingenuous to say that we are doing it well. And I'm not talking about, do our public open houses work well? Do we have the right graphics? Are we putting things on the internet? I'm not convinced that we're having the conversation with everyone. And part of what makes that even harder is I don't think we know who everyone is. I think that one of the greatest challenges of being a good public servant is learning how to listen, and especially to the voices that are extremely quiet. And when we try to think about who's not in the room, so we often hear the people who are in the room. Over dinner we were talking about a bit of a public engagement explosion that happened yesterday in Calgary. I'm sure that if you've been following, you saw that the mayor canceled all future BRT public engagement due to one particularly horrible meeting. And for anyone who's ever been at a public engagement meeting that's gone even a little bit sideways, I think your heart kind of went, oh, that must have been really tough. But I think one of the things that, I think about is that sometimes, and I know that we know this, sometimes I think that we hear from the loudest voices, the most persistent voices, and the folks who probably don't have time to come out to events because they've got 3 jobs, or they don't speak the language, or this isn't part of their normal course of thinking of how they're in the city, they're not part of the conversation. So I think it's important to do better public engagement and to work with communities, but I also challenge us to ask ourselves who we think community is. So that's something I keep asking myself as a professional, and I don't think there's an easy answer.
Excuse me. Yeah, I think one of the things I always struggle with engagement is what you're actually trying to achieve out of this. And we were talking about this at dinner as well. And sometimes the engagement processes that we use in planning are more just sharing information. Developers got a proposal, we're sharing the information to make sure everybody understands what the developer's proposing. I think the thing we don't do quite as well sometimes is actually engaging communities into decision making. But you have to make that decision up front, and we work in a legal framework that says you have to do certain things at certain times, and that's part of the framework. But when you get to actually engaging a community, you're actually trying to get them into the part of the decision making as well. I don't think we do that quite as well as we could sometimes.
Conscious we're running out of time, but Simon, I want to let you weigh in here as well.
I think it's just, it's a lot better today than it was. But I also feel like you have to be constantly rechecking or checking back in, because on the continuum between the kind of Robert Moses approach to city building and Jane Jacobs, I feel like in some ways we went from one side of the pendulum to the other, and the result is that sometimes, maybe we don't like sometimes all the built form in China. I think a lot of us drool and envy at China's ability to build LRT and high-speed rail and do these things really quickly, and cities sometimes spend 10 years navel gazing and dialoguing and don't move the yardsticks at all in building infrastructure. So I think sometimes we have to decide when do we kind of have to be a little bit more the Robert Moses in the larger public good, like LRT sometimes, and certain things that I think are absolutely critical to building a city. And then on the smaller scale, when can we be more of the Jane Jacobson-esque, really thoughtful questions to people, and be great listeners, as was also said. So to me, it's picking where you want to be on the continuum relative to the type of project you're doing.
Thanks again, and can we offer a final round of applause for our panel?